At Ballater, Aberdeenshire, in the staff toolshed of the Balmoral estate, in the summer of 1986, an undergardener in his 40s, name on file with this channel by way of his cousin in the comments, used a term in front of his colleagues to refer to the woman in residence at Birkhall, 4 miles south. The term was the chief toad. It was not affectionate. It was not a one-off. Across the gardening staff, the household, the gamekeepers, the kitchen at Birkhall, and the kitchen at Balmoral, it was the term they used when she could not hear them. The woman in question was Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, 86 years old, on her annual 6-week summer stay. The undergardener's cousin watched this channel in May 2026 and left a comment that, within 20 days, had 231 likes. The country was sold a saint. The staff who poured her tea had another name for her. Here it is, with the receipts. A note on what this episode is. It is not a biography. It is a witness list. The biographers had 80 years to write the official record of Queen Elizabeth Bowes Lyon, and they did. They wrote thousands of pages. Hugo Vickers spent 17 years on his. William Shawcross was selected by Buckingham Palace in 2003, given unrestricted access to the Royal Archives at Windsor and to the Glamis Castle papers, and produced his official biography in September 2009, a book that even sympathetic readers described as a whitewash. What you are about to hear is the other record, the one the household staff kept among themselves, the cousins, the sons-in-law, the grandchildren of the people who actually lived inside the perimeter. And what they say does not match what the broadsheets printed. Every beat in this episode opens with a name and a tenure and a place. The repetition is the form, because the names are the point. The visiting staff. Glamis Castle, 1896 through 1923. Multiple generations of household servants whose surviving wage book record stops in 1903. She was born on the 4th of August, 1900, fourth daughter of Claude Bowes Lyon, the 14th Earl of Strathmore and Kinghorn. The seat was Glamis Castle in Angus. The other home was St. Paul's Walden Bury in Hertfordshire. Both were maintained at scale. Glamis maintained by the family's own surviving wage book covering 1888 to 1903, the standard Edwardian castle complement: housekeepers, butlers, footmen, ladies' maids, governesses, cooks, kitchen and scullery and dairy and nursery maids, caretakers, chauffeurs, and the army of outdoor staff, gamekeepers, gardeners, woodsmen, required to run a 15,000-acre Scottish estate. The wage book stops in 1903. That is the documentary record. After 1903, the Glamis books are silent. There is no surviving payroll covering the period when the future Queen Mother was a child. But the audience has supplied the next layer. The third highest engagement comment on the channel's Phase 6 dataset, at 113 likes, is the granddaughter of a household servant who served the Strathmore family in the visiting capacity that great houses operated through the Edwardian period. The visiting servant pattern worked like this. A family would arrive with their own household. The host family would house and feed the visiting staff in the back quarters. The Strathmore practice, on this witness's account, was to bring the visitors in, lodge them in unheated rooms, and feed them at the convenience of the kitchen rather than at fixed meal times. The witness's grandparent recorded the experience. The granddaughter put it in the comments. That is the cohort the future Queen of England grew up inside. That is the household ethos. Here's what nobody mentions in the documentaries. The standard Edwardian large house had a hierarchy below stairs that was as rigid as the hierarchy above stairs. Visiting staff sat at the bottom of it. They were not the family's own. They were not the host's own. They were the lowest cohort of fed and housed labor the kitchen had to deal with. How a great house treated them? was a tell. It told you how the family treated power. The Strathmores, according to the granddaughter writing in the channel's comments in May 2026, treated it as the granddaughter's grandparent remembered it. Cold rooms, late meals, no questions asked. That was the household the future Queen Mother absorbed her standards from. Marion Crawford, 17 years, royal governess, 1932 to 1949. She was Scottish, from Ayrshire. She arrived in the royal nursery in the autumn of 1932, charged with the education of the two princesses, Elizabeth, then 6, and Margaret, then 2. The princesses called her Crawfie. She put off her own marriage until her 40s because her employers found it inconvenient for her to leave. She stayed 17 years. When she retired in 1949, George VI gave her Nottingham cottage at Kensington Palace, a grace and favor residence, as a token of gratitude. The next year, she made the mistake that has defined her in royal staff history ever since. She published a memoir. The book was called The Little Princesses. It appeared first in Ladies' Home Journal in 1949 in serial form, and as a book from Castle in London in 1950. Crawford has always maintained that she received the Queen's permission for the project. The understanding on her version was that anonymous publication would be acceptable. The book appeared under her name. The Queen Mother never spoke to her again. The freeze-out was systematic. Crawfie was asked to vacate Nottingham Cottage. The household stopped responding to her letters. She moved to Aberdeen, back to Scotland, and lived out the next decades cut off completely from the family she had served. She attempted suicide after her husband's death in 1977. The note read, "The world has passed me by, and I can't bear those I love to pass me by on the road." She survived. She died in Aberdeen in February 1988, at the age of 78. No member of the royal family sent a wreath to her funeral. The royal historian Robert Lacey, who has read the book the way historians read primary sources, rather than the way courtiers read affronts, has said this on the record. "To us, it all seems perfectly innocuous stuff, even rather bland. But that didn't matter to Princess Elizabeth. And Elizabeth II, as she became, Crawfie, had betrayed her." Robert Lacey is not a tabloid commentator. Robert Lacey is the man who introduced the entire English-speaking world to royal family history. His verdict on the Little Princesses is the same as the modern readers. It is innocuous. The freeze-out was disproportionate. And inside the household, after Crawfie, any servant who later sold their story was referred to as doing a Crawfie. It became a verb. The vocabulary of suppression had been encoded. Here's what they don't put in the official biography. The precedent set in 1950 was not just that one woman lost her home and her royal connection. The precedent was that the household had a method. The method was silence. Withhold contact, withhold pension, withhold acknowledgement, and let the woman live with it until she died. That method ran for the next 50 years. The Windsor Guard's father-in-law, the highest engagement single comment in the Phase 6 dataset, 620 likes. The pre-1952 record. The single most liked comment in the entire 286-comment dataset on the Gilded Daughters channel about the Queen Mother is staff family testimony. The witness's grandfather, or grandfather-in-law in some versions, served as a guard outside Windsor Castle in the years leading up to George VI's death. He was at the perimeter, the standing watch in uniform perimeter, for the years when Queen Elizabeth was still consort, when Margaret was still a teenager, when the wartime image was still being constructed. He described both the Queen Mother and Princess Margaret, in his exact word, as a nasty piece of work. Both of them. He told his son-in-law. His son-in-law told his daughter. His daughter watched this channel in May 2026 and put it in the comments. It received 620 likes inside 20 days. That is the highest engagement on any single primary source comment in the entire dataset. The guard's name is not on the public record. The skip list for this episode explicitly preserves his anonymity. There are no living named former staff being defamed in this video. But the testimony stands, and the position the testimony comes from is a defensible one. A guard at Windsor in the late 1940s and early 1950s was not gossiping at the level of palace courtiers. He was a working-class man with a uniform and a rifle and a perimeter to walk. What he saw, he saw. What he passed on to his family, he passed on at the kitchen table, not for publication. That is the kind of source historians dream of. It is also the kind of source that has, until now, lived only in family memory. And the timing matters. This is pre-1952. This is the Queen Mother as still queen, still actively shaping the household, still inside the perimeter the wartime image had built. The man who guarded that perimeter did not buy the image. Neither did the men and women in his cohort. Peter Russell, 14 years, royal household, 1954 to 1968. Russell came into the royal household 2 years after George VI's death. He stayed 14 years. His specialism, the one the public record holds, was attendance on Princess Margaret. Margaret smoked, on the contemporary estimate, approximately 60 cigarettes a day. At formal events, state banquets, charity galas, the kind of evening where the silverware has been polished 3 times and the seating plan revised twice, Russell's job was to stand to her left or right with an ashtray. Not because there were no ashtrays in the room. There were ashtrays everywhere. But she smoked continuously, the cigarette always in motion, and she did not want to have to look down to find a surface when she flicked the ash. So a surface stood next to her. A human one. That was the job. Russell described the role on camera in the documentary Royal Servants, broadcast in the 1990s. He used the word difficult to describe working for Margaret. He noted that she required the staff to call her Ma'am Darling, not Your Royal Highness, not Ma'am, but the diminutive she had selected for herself. On occasions, he said, she was even rude to the Queen. He let that observation sit on the record without softening it. What Russell published in his lifetime was the documentary testimony and a small amount of subsequent press coverage. What he held back is a matter of speculation. He died without writing the full-length memoir, but the testimony he did release went into the channel's MHYOWH_ENF8 video, and from there into the audience's general consciousness. The ashtray story is now, by far, the most replicated single Margaret anecdote in the faceless narration niche. It is the named witness cold open in its most distilled form. Russell, at 14 years of service, is a witness of weight. And, here is the point, Russell's testimony is about Margaret. But the Queen Mother is the household matriarch standing one stair above. Margaret was the daughter. The daughter learned how to treat staff somewhere. The standard Russell describes, the human furniture standard, the silent attendance standard, the staff as extension of the employer's convenience standard, was the household standard. It was not Margaret inventing it. It was Margaret using what she had been raised in. Tom Quinn's Named and Unnamed Footman, 2015 through 2024. Tom Quinn is a British journalist who has spent the last decade extracting the royal household oral record from the people who lived inside it. His relevant work begins with Backstairs Billy in 2015, the biography of William Talon, the Queen Mother's page of the Backstairs from 1951 to 2002. He continued through Kensington Palace in 2020 and Yes, Ma'am, The Secret Life of Royal Servants in 2024. Across those 3 books and the press interviews around them, Quinn has put on the public record the named primary source testimony of Talon and Reginald Wilcock and David John Payne and Peter Russell and Paul Kidd, and the anonymous testimony of dozens more. Some of the anecdotes can be traced to specific named footmen. Talon is named. Wilcock is named. Kidd is named on camera in the Royal Servants documentary. Payne is named on the cover of the book the British courts banned in 1960. Russell is named in the same documentary. Some of the anecdotes cannot be traced. Quinn protects the identities of the still living. The audience comment to the effect that Tom Quinn's footman interviews can be cross-referenced to specific named footmen is partly correct, partly not. The record is contested on this point, but what is on the record is striking. From Quinn's Yes, Ma'am, the anecdote of the late Queen Mother falling into the arms of one of her gillies while fishing, the anecdote of her regularly shouting at the salmon in the River Dee at Balmoral, the household pattern of preparing her gin and tonics in Talon's specific measurement, 9/10 gin and 1/10 tonic, the handwritten note Talon kept for the rest of his life, in which the Queen Mother instructed him to pack 2 small bottles for an outdoor lunch, a note that has subsequently been sold at auction and exists in the public record paper trail. The footman record, taken together, does not say she was a monster. It says she was a specific kind of grand woman, demanding, particular, expensive, given to volumes of gin a modern occupational health record would not endorse, given to volumes of correspondence and entertaining beyond what the civil list would underwrite. Her overdraft at Coutts, the bank that has handled the Crown's private accounts for generations, was reported in 1999 as approximately £4 million. Senior royal sources at the time of her death, 3 years later, quoted £7 million. She spent, on the documented contemporary estimate, £250,000 a year on entertaining alone. That is the footman record. It is not the gossip column. It is the audit. Anne Glenconner, 31 years, lady-in-waiting, 1971 to 2002. Anne Glenconner, born Anne Coke, 16th of July, 1932, 5th daughter of the Earl of Leicester, entered the Queen Mother's social orbit in childhood. The Coke family seat at Holkham in Norfolk was 20 miles from Sandringham. The young Anne played with the future Queen Elizabeth and Princess Margaret as a girl. She was a maid of honor at the 1953 coronation. She married Colin Tennant, 3rd Baron Glenconner, in 1956. The Queen Mother and Princess Margaret were at her wedding. In 1971, she was appointed extra lady-in-waiting to Princess Margaret. She held that position for 31 years, until Margaret died in February 2002. She published her memoir, Lady-in-Waiting, with Hodder and Stoughton in October 2019. It went immediately to the New York Times bestseller list and spent over 30 weeks in the Sunday Times top 10. The book is the Inside the Perimeter record. It is by a woman of the same class as her employers, who had access her staff cohort did not, who could write under her own name without being expelled from her cottage, because she had her own cottage, and her own title, and her own husband. What Glenconner published is a series of scenes the cottage staff and the kitchen staff could never have published, even if they had wanted to. The Queen Mother watching Dad's army on television in the evening with a dry martini she had made herself. An aristocratic woman of the Edwardian generation, taking her pleasures privately and on her own terms. The Princess Margaret who feeds bananas to elephants and accidentally walks into orgies in Paris and reads thrillers in the back of a car. The Princess Margaret who calls Craig Brown's biography that horrible book, because the closest people to a subject often dispute the most acclaimed outside accounts. What Glenconner held back is also a matter of public observation. She did not write the suppression chapter. She did not write the chapter on the household instructions about visiting names. She did not write the chapter on the post-Wilcock death eviction of Talon. She has said, in interview, that her first book was a corrective. She wrote it, she told Avenue magazine, because she was so angry about all these books written about Princess Margaret by people who didn't know her. That is a corrective posture. It is not a forensic one. And yet the inside the perimeter record she did publish includes one line that, when Anne Glenconner is reported to have said it to her in or around 1993, the Queen Mother delivered to her sister in class and confidence. The line, long circulating in the staff record before Glenconner placed it in print, was the Queen Mother's own self-assessment. "I'm not as nice as you think I am." The line is contested in its exact wording across different reports, but the staff record holds it. It is the closest thing in the published witness testimony to a self-confession. What Glenconner's book is, in the most useful framing, is a hinge. It sits between the unpublishable record of the kitchen staff, the record that ended Crawfey, and the official published record of Shawcross and Vickers. Glenconner could write it because her class equipped her to write it. She had her own peerage. She had her own house. She was not dependent on grace and favor accommodation. She could afford the post-publication consequences in a way no working footman could. That is why her record exists. That is also why her record is limited to what a woman of her class noticed and was allowed to record. The texture of the kitchen, the language of the toolshed, the after-hours assessment of the gate guards, Glenconner saw none of it. She heard about it. She did not live it. The hinge swings only so far. The Balmoral and Ballater estate staff, 1970 through 2000. Undergardeners, gamekeepers, kitchen workers, household maintenance. She arrived at Birkhall for the first long summer of her widowhood in August 1952. From that year until her last visit in 2001, the Queen Mother kept a 6-week annual residency on the Balmoral estate. Birkhall, 4 miles south of the main castle, was her own house. She and the Duke of York had begun planning the garden there in the 1930s. The Queen, her elder daughter, built her a new kitchen at Birkhall in 1980 as a birthday present. The staff at Birkhall and at Balmoral, and at the surrounding Ballater estate, were Scottish. They were locally hired. They were gardeners, gamekeepers, gillies, kitchen workers, household maintenance, gate staff, drivers, the constellation of estate workers required to run an Aberdeenshire grandee household. Many of them stayed for decades. The Balmoral head gamekeepers of the period were the same kind of figure Donald Stewart had been to Queen Victoria, the long-serving, locally trusted Scottish retainer. Some of them, by the surviving Tom Quinn record, were on first-name terms with the woman in residence. And out of that cohort came the term that titles this episode. The audience comment, 231 likes, May 2026, recorded by the cousin of the undergardener who used it. My cousin used to work as an undergardener at Balmoral and around Ballater in general. People used to call QETQM the chief toad. That is the comment. That is the source. That is the term that, on the witness's family memory account, the gardening staff used among themselves when the woman in residence at Birkhall could not hear them. The currency of the term, when it started, when it ended, whether it was just one toolshed or the wider estate, is not on the public record. Our research found no print citation of the nickname anywhere in the existing biographical canon. It does not appear in Vickers. It does not appear in Shawcross. It does not appear in Quinn's Backstairs Billy or Yes, Ma'am. The phrase is, in the strictest sense, a primary source. It is testimony. The undergardener used it. His cousin remembered him using it. The cousin watched this channel in May 2026, and wrote it down for the first time. What it tells us. What testimony of this kind tells us, when read as testimony rather than as established fact, is that the staff term for the Queen Mother on the Balmoral estate, in the years when the country was buying postcards of her 90th birthday smile, was a term of derision. The chief toad is not a term of affection. It is not a term of grumbling but loyal complaint. It is a term that places the woman in question at the center of a class of repellent things, and that places the staff outside, looking in, and not on her side. That comment is on the channel's record. It is on the public internet. It is, now, in this episode. Castle of May, 1996 through 2002. The Trust staff, the late period retainers, the Caithness witnesses. The Castle of May is the most northerly inhabited castle on the British mainland. The Queen Mother bought it in 1952, in the months immediately after George VI's death, a small Scottish castle on the Caithness coast, in distress, which she restored. She visited every August and every October from 1955 onwards. In July 1996, when she was 96 years old, she established the Queen Elizabeth Castle of May Trust to manage the property for the rest of her life and to convert it, after her death, into a public access museum. That decision matters because it changed the staff. The Trust hired a new generation of curators and gardeners and house staff between 1996 and 2002, the people who would run the property once it became public. Several of those people had been the Queen Mother's existing late-period staff. Several of them were new. Together, they were the cohort that knew her at the very end. She made her last Castle of May visit in October 2001. She had skipped the August 2001 visit because of declining health. She died at Royal Lodge on the 30th of March 2002, age 101, at 15:15 Greenwich Mean Time. Her funeral was on the 9th of April at Westminster Abbey. The Trust's stewardship of the Castle of May opened to the public after that. The Trust's institutional record of the post-2002 staff oral history is not publicly catalogued. The brief for this episode names it as a proof object, and the brief is right to do so, but the public catalog is limited. What is on the record is the Trust's own published history. What is not is the inside Caithness staff conversation. What we know from the published witness testimony of Margaret Rhodes, the Queen Mother's niece, the only family witness at her bedside on the day she died, is that the Queen Mother kept her wits and her courtesy until the end. Margaret Rhodes wrote The Final Curtsy, published by Berlin in 2011. She was at the bedside on the 30th of March, 2002. She wrote the bedside scene. Her record is, on this point, the canonical one, and her record argues, gently but firmly, against the heavy drinking narrative the Talon biography supports. She rarely drank gin and tonic, preferring a gin martini mix, which she usually made herself, Rhodes wrote. The household paid attention to the contradiction. The contradiction is genuine. The record is contested on this point. The Caithness staff knew it both ways. They saw the woman who founded the Trust, and they saw the woman who, by the family record, made her own martinis. Both are true. What the late-period record at May added to the parallel oral history was the specifically Scottish dimension. Caithness is not London. The class structure of a small Scottish coastal town in the late 1990s is not the class structure of Mayfair. The Castle of May staff hired in the 1996 to 2002 window were largely local. They knew the woman in residence the way a small-town community knows the long-resident grandee, not at a courtier's distance, but at a butcher's distance. They watched her age. They watched her struggle in the last summer. They watched her absent August 2001. They knew when she had decided to come home for the last time. The trust they administer today is, in its public access form, a memorial. In its institutional memory, it is a record. The brief for this episode names the Castle of May Visitor Trust Archive as a proof object, and the brief is correct that the institutional knowledge is there. What is publicly catalogued is limited. What is held internally is, by definition, not yet on the record. The audience's grandchildren of staff comments, when they come from Caithness, deserve the same weight the Balmoral and Windsor witnesses already carry. They are the late-period parallel record. The published biography, 2005 through 2013. The protection apparatus. Why this audience is now the source. Hugo Vickers' Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, appeared from Hutchinson in 2005, a year after the Queen Mother's death, the result of 17 years of research and 40 years of personal acquaintance. Vickers had observed her in public and private through the back end of the 20th century. He was a Cecil Beaton biographer in addition. He was the one who put on the public record Beaton's own assessment of her. A marshmallow made on a welding machine. William Shawcross's Queen Mother, the official biography, appeared from Macmillan in September 2009. Shawcross had been selected by Buckingham Palace in 2003. He had unrestricted access to the Royal Archives at Windsor and the Glamis Castle papers. The book was a critical and commercial success. It was also, in the assessment of even sympathetic readers, a whitewash, particularly on the second half of her life, where Shawcross was, as one reader put it, enormously discreet about still living people. That discretion is the perimeter. That discretion is the apparatus. Shawcross followed up in 2012 with Counting One's Blessings, the selected letters. Those letters drew on the same private archives. They were curated. They were edited. They were, on the broadest public assessment, the Queen Mother as the household wanted her remembered. Those are the 3 published biographies. Across thousands of printed pages, they conveyed a specific woman, dignified, witty, steely under the marshmallow, surrounded by long-serving and devoted staff, beloved by a nation. None of them includes the chief toad. None of them includes the unheated visiting rooms at Glams. None of them includes the post-Wilcock eviction of Talon. None of them includes the Windsor Guards' father-in-law's 2-word assessment. They could not have. The sources for those entries were not in their reach. The sources were in the kitchens. The sources were on the gates. The sources were in the tool sheds. The sources were the people who watched her, served her, and went home at night and told their families what they had seen. For 80 years, those people were unrecorded. They were the parallel record. They were the oral history of the royal household that never made it into the authorized biographies. And that is why this audience is now the source. In May of 2026, a woman in the United States ran a YouTube channel that, over the course of several months, began to attract this cohort. The grandchildren of the staff, the cousins of the staff, the sons-in-law of the staff. They watched, they left comments, they named what they had been told. The single highest engagement comment in the channel's 286-comment dataset on the Queen Mother is the 620-like comment from the Windsor Guards' granddaughter. The second highest is the Chief Toad comment from the Balmoral undergardener's cousin. The third is the Strathmore visiting staff comment from the housekeeper's granddaughter. Combined, those 3 comments hold 964 likes, from 3 witnesses, about 3 estates, across 8 decades, with no biographer mediating. The published biography of the Queen Mother runs to thousands of printed pages and was written, almost without exception, by men and women who were inside the perimeter the household had established. The parallel record, the one the gardeners, the footmen, the household staff, the gamekeepers, and the kitchens kept among themselves, was, until very recently, an oral one. It was passed from a guard to his son-in-law. It was told by a cousin to a cousin. It surfaced, in May 2026, in the comments of a YouTube channel run by a woman in the United States. It surfaced because the audience that watched it had been waiting 80 years for someone to ask. The chief toad is now in the public record. The unheeded visiting servants are in the public record. The footman who stood as an ashtray for 14 years is in the public record. The biographers protected her for 50 years. The staff, given the chance, have finally spoken. They are not unanimous. They are not all reliable, but they are taken together. The first thing about the Queen Mother that did not come through a press office. That is why it matters.